Now, we come to Darwin, and Darwin is arguably the most important single person in biology. His ideas basically describe the diversity and unity of life, okay, this idea of descent with modification. And he goes further than that to attribute adaptive change to a mechanism that we all know now as natural selection. Now we're going to read chapter 4 from The Origin of Species, and we'll discuss this in class. A little bit on Darwin. Darwin was the son of a medical doctor. He was relatively privileged. He was what they called a gentleman scientist. Growing up, he toyed around with several different possible professions, including medicine and the clergy. Okay, Darwin was a religious man, again, like most people back then. On a whim, he took the job as the ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle, which was primarily a mapping mission. The British Crown wanted to map their territories in South America. And his job was to collect specimens, anything and everything that he found that he could kill, and send it back to the Royal Museum in England. And he did this. I think that the trip was supposed to be 2 years, and it lasted closer to 5. And while traveling around the world, he began to see patterns. And some of the most famous patterns that he saw were on the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are now iconic islands when you think of evolutionary biology. He noticed, for example, that the finches on the Galapagos Islands very closely resembled the finches on the South American mainland, but they were different in that they were well suited for the environment of the Galapagos Islands. And a finch on one island where they had trees with very large seeds had larger beaks than a finch on a smaller island that had smaller seeds. In other words, he started to see that organisms fit nicely in their environment, but they also resembled other organisms around. In other words, it appeared that they descended from a common ancestor and changed to become more well suited for their environment. Now, he wrote The Origin of Species after sitting on these ideas for years. He understood the implications of what he was about to publish. Indeed, one of his friends, or colleagues rather, said after reading his manuscript that he had killed God. His wife was extremely religious. He was struggling with his own faith. And like I said, he sat on it for a long time. The work was finally published in 1859. He called it an abstract, which most of you probably understand that means kind of a short summary. And it was, it sold out immediately. He based his ideas on 2 observations, which led to 2 inferences. This is summarized in your book, but I'll go over it just very briefly here. The first observation was that members of a population often vary greatly in their traits, both morphological and physiological, and these traits are inherited from their parents. You can see in this picture here, these snails are exhibiting a wide array of, shell colors. And you could imagine that when they are on one type of background, a darker snail might be more cryptic than a lighter snail, and the opposite might be true on another background. This variation, in other words, becomes ecologically important. The second observation that he made is that all species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. Humans are the only species, as far as I know, that tries to curtail reproductive output through things like birth control. All other plants and animals try to maximize it. And in light of the fact that resources are always finite, this means that some offspring do not make it. Some lose this struggle for existence. And this led to two inferences. The first one is that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and therefore reproducing tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. Okay? So if you're able to beat the predator, if you're able to outrun the predator, you get to survive and therefore reproduce. If you don't outrun the predator, you're obviously dead. Similarly, if you're better at getting any resource, if you're better at getting nitrogen, if you're a terrestrial plant, if you're better at getting water, if you're a desert tortoise, you win. The rest of them lose because resources are finite. And this led to the final inference. This unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of adaptive traits in subsequent generations. And this is precisely because offspring tend to resemble their parents. So if your parent has the ability to outrun a predator, that ability is probably going to be passed on to you. Now, these two observations and these two inferences that are the result of these observations are the type of thing that when you think about it, you scratch your head and you say, duh, why didn't I think of this? It's just so simple. And it makes so much sense. And this is why we're still talking about Darwin today. So what I would like you to do now is look through the chapter, take the chapter 19 quiz on Blackboard, and be prepared for a discussion of the Darwinian way of thinking and some of the evidence for descent with modification and some of the evidence for the ways that natural selection fashions adaptive traits in organisms.